All right, check it out. We have a cool logo. Just having a logo makes me feel a lot more professional. I like that.
Did you make that yourself?
I did not. I forced my wife to help me. She's a graphic designer. So today we're going to talk about testing with Enzyme. This is my name. It was fun to fill out this box. And I put the date because if anybody watches this video later on and it's April 14, they're going to be like, oh, that's old technology, forget it, who cares, right? Okay, just want to give you the overview about what we're talking about today. So the reason this started was, do we even need testing? The way that React works, and I'll go over this, is so cool and new with the one-way data flow and all that. So do we even need it? So we're going to talk about how would you test without Enzyme, testing with Enzyme, and then some of the challenges, right? And we talked about Webpack. I love Webpack. I haven't even tried Browserify, but Webpack is also a huge pain in the ass. So it's both, at least for me. Has anybody asked this question in general? Do we need testing? Do I really need testing? Have you fought with a coworker, a boss, or anything? Do I need it? And when I say testing, I'm referring to unit testing. Okay, so just in case you're not familiar, there's multiple types of testing with software. The default form of testing is manual. You create a website, you go over to it, click a few things, you think to yourself, that doesn't work, that sucks, why did I do it wrong? And you go back and it just takes forever. You can have automated browser testing or acceptance testing, but that's typically slow, it takes a lot of work to set it up. So in between the automated browser testing and you doing it manually is, I would call it unit testing, right? This is where you test just your little functions, your methods, and this applies even to React. When you write your render method, all your helper methods, you got to test those. So I was thinking to myself, do we even need it? Now why? Why are we starting with testing in the first place for React? There's so many cool things going on. Well, I want to tell you a story. So first of all, I did C++ mainly in college. As a computer science grad at Colorado, I felt very cool and nerdy. I was Unix, I was in there, and I hated testing. We got introduced to it. I hated it so much that I just swore to myself, like, oh, this is awful, never again. And I think the problem was mostly the tooling. The tests ran so fast in C++ that it was awesome, but I just thought it was such a pain, and to get code coverage, I just felt like, ugh. And then one day, I remember it was really interesting because I was out playing volleyball, and just in the middle of playing volleyball, it hit me. Testing is the answer. Yes, this is it. And I started getting this big grin on my face, like this, and my friend looks at me and she's like, you know, based on the smile on your face, I'd have to guess that you've been eating doo-doo, because you have a doo-doo eating grin on your face. And it was that realization that testing is going to be the key to me really getting what I want. So I love to code. Probably all of you do too, but the biggest challenge is, does my stuff actually work? And I've done the thing, true, when I was in Windows, and whether it's been web work and Android, and no matter what it's been, I've done the thing where I create it, I press run, I go test it manually. It takes me 2 minutes to run this test, you know, especially if you've ever done Android development. Those things eat up a lot of memory on your machine. They're slow. It's kind of a pain. So if you do a manual test, it takes a long time. And I did that because I didn't know a better way. Even when I was working at decently large companies, we had 30 developers. None of us did testing. It just wasn't part of our culture. So when I discovered testing and realized how much faster it can help me realize or recognize, did I do this code correctly? It was just mind-boggling. So here we are in React world. Do you do unit testing? So just quick show of hands, who does unit testing in their projects that involve React? Okay, we've got 3 half hands, you're 3/4 hand, and okay, a few people, maybe 5-ish. Okay, and that's good. And so my question is, do we need it? And let's just vote for the people that, actually, even if you didn't raise your hand, you can still vote. Do you think it's important? Do you need unit testing? Yes. Oh, okay. So we've got a lot of conflicting, yeah, okay. And you're not going to be wrong if you say this. Has anybody felt like, yeah, I tested it, or I tried out testing, it wasn't worth it? And who thinks that it's not really that important? your team doesn't like it, anything. Okay, so clearly there's some non-voters, but that's fine. So I think part of the reason I'm asking the question, do we even need testing, is because React is so different. I consider React and Flux the holy grail. Why? Well, slides are out of order there. So up at the top, virtual DOM and one-way data flow, React is new. It's different. It does things differently. It's so cool. So it's really fast and it's simple. And thus, if things are so fast and so simple, based on this, do you really need unit testing? Let me give you a more concrete example. There you are, sitting at your computer, and somebody sends you an email and says, hey, can you look over this code? And you're just glancing at their React component. It's got an if statement, if true, render this, otherwise render it that way. And you're just thinking to yourself, what's there to even test? It's like one condition, so why even bother? And that's really what I thought. That's really why I started asking myself this, who even needs it? And I ran into a lot of problems. I do not have a slide for it, I just forgot it, but something that I ran into was a very simple map. Okay, so if you want to print out a list of things, should be easy enough to do, right? You just map over those things, dump them out in your render method. Well, that blew up on me because I was using seamless immutable, and that has a problem with map. I don't know if anybody's run into that, or if you're using immutable JS or something, but that was something, just by looking at the code, I thought, there's no way that it's just a for loop. How could there be a problem with that? But there was. So that's why I started thinking, yeah, there's probably some value here to unit testing. I put this slide in here because, so has anybody seen this video with Anna Kendrick redoing this? Okay. It's about a 4-minute long video. It's hilarious. She basically goes in, this is mocking Indiana Jones in The Last Crusade, and she goes in there and she's like, you've been alive for hundreds of years now. Aren't you bored? Like, what do you eat? And just a mocking thing, but so it's a redo. And I love React and Flux and all this, and it's the new hip, cool kid on the block. But there's always going to be a new cool kid coming along, right? And so, not too long ago, this was the new cool kid. And so even though I love it, React and Flux is not the holy grail, but I still consider it a holy grail. Does that make sense? Have you guys seen that? I assume that the fact that you're in here means you think React is pretty cool. Okay. So when you unit test, you've got the tests themselves. Oh, by the way, I forgot to tell you guys, I'm really big on interactivity, so I'm going to be looking for hands throughout this thing. And, we're all facing one thing. In a perfect world, we'd have the King Arthur roundtable situation going on where we could all kind of discuss more. But so here's a question, and just holler out. What do you get beyond just the tests themselves? What else do you get when you unit test? You've got the tests, but what else goes along with that?
One thing you didn't mention is that when you develop, you break previously built stuff. So unit test makes it clear that when you make a change, how it affects the existing working website or project.
That's great. Okay, it affects how it's already. So if after you build the project, yeah, you want to change some stuff. It affects how things are going. Yeah.
I was just going to say it's just part of your overall testing suite that ensures that requirements are mapped accurately. So you're building what you're supposed to be building.
That's great. Okay, so tests as a way of knowing, like you've probably heard of executable tests. And if you've ever heard of Cucumber or used some of those libraries, that's a way to, the specifications are the test. And when the tests pass, you know that you've done it. You've completed the entire mission. You're ready to launch your product. Okay, anything else?
I got proven that testing is so crucial in the current project that I'm on.
Uh-huh.
So initially we had a
started the project.
Uh-huh.
And finally, they all like they would contact us with and all that. I was the only one left on the team. Like the project became complex and complex because the business requirements kept on changing.
Uh-huh.
Because what I built was a overtime calculation for a utility industry. So 10,000 test cases, if they actually put it in spreadsheets.
Okay.
That's like I started Jasmine unit testing, and that Jasmine is the reason for the successful delivery production because I was able to deliver with confidence every build. The first 3 builds, I fixed 3 issues, 20 were broken, and people were waiting in the room like this. They were testing, they got frustrated.
Okay.
I said, like, why am I doing this? Then I spent almost 10 15 days just building all the test framework and everything. After that, every build was perfect. Like, means met the requirements,
Okay.
didn't break anything else,
Awesome.
and they were like super happy.
Developing with confidence.
Yeah, delivering with confidence.
Delivering.
Delivering.
Okay. And developing. But that is a great story. Yes, I'm glad that you said that. Yeah.
You probably already pointed this out in the example. It's a good way to document.
Yeah.
Guy says, oh, it's a map, how can that possibly fail? It can fail, and this is how, and really unchecking it. So, later,
Gotcha. Okay. Great answer. Yeah.
It basically builds an explicit interface for future development, whether it's ambitions or make sure that whatever they change doesn't break your explicit contract.
Awesome. It gives you a contract. Okay.
Unit testing also allows you to do separations of concerns. So instead of having one file do a lot of stuff, so testing that file would be hard. So you actually do what you do is separate concerns and simplify the test. So you can implement unit testing, which allows you to develop something.
Okay. So separation of concerns. That's good. I was thinking about phrasing that. I think it's the same thing. Before you start developing, it helps you think, what are we even building in the first place? How am I going to design this thing?
I was just going to mention, no one else is mentioning here, but sleep. I get to sleep at night. I don't get a phone call at 4 a.m. because something's broken and they can't process a credit card payment.
Ooh, okay. I heard about
So
that.
that's
Home
what we-
Depot this last weekend had trouble with credit cards, and a lot of people were upset.
Yeah, so unit testing for me means I don't get that 4 a.m. phone call to fix something.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah, nobody likes those. Okay.
Now we hope.
These are probably things that you've talked about before. Should we test? You probably know this, but I wanted to go over it because it applies to React as well. It's still important. It's still, if you haven't had the experience of how much happier you can be, how much more confident you can be with your development, that type of thing, try it. Push whoever you need to, boss, coworker, etc., to add some tests. But it's not easy. You do have to change how you write things. So, for example, if you're used to writing methods that are this long, this typically just don't work when testing, because you need to test this section right here, but it's part of this thing like this. I mean, so it's not something that you can do overnight. Now, I'm not suggesting that you can't add it in a little bit at a time, but it's hard to. It's hard to. So it's one of those things where people get a little preachy on it, right? Like, oh, you don't even have unit tests, but it's going to be a transition. So you can't just go to your boss and say, like, look, I'm telling you, I went to this meetup and he said it was great, so now you have to do it or whatever. Like, it's not going to be something that you add overnight and your life is totally going to be simpler. And why didn't I do this before? At first, you're going to think, this is hard, and how do I even test? And we're going to talk about a little of that today. How do you test? But just be aware that these things. And so my advice on testing is treat it like regular code. Meaning, in the same way that you have code that you need to refactor and comment and design well, you have to do the same thing with your tests. One more thing, I don't know how many of you guys are in this boat. If you work for big companies like GoDaddy, you probably have things designed out better. But as a freelancer, I get this all the time. So I'll have a client come to me and be like, how was that thing supposed to work again? I'm like, you're the designer. Like, you're the one who told me how it should work. I did it. That was a year ago. Sorry. And that's unfortunate I have to tell him, but that happens all the time. If you have tests, it's recorded right there. You know what it's supposed to do. Okay, for today, we are going to be talking about this sample app. Okay, this is an idea that I've had for years. It's had various stages of success, whether I've actually built it. So, I mean, years ago. This started as a whiteboard at my house, and people loved it. And then I moved it to a phone app, and it worked for a while. And then my version of Android died, and all this. So, someday I want to complete this, and I hope you can enjoy it. But the quote board is funny things that your friends say that you want to capture. Okay. And typically they're goofy, like I round anything between 8 and 12 to 11, like what? But that was hilarious when my brother said that. So let's just talk about the layout, and then we'll talk about how our code might be structured and what it's going to look like. So we've got some header, but ignore that. For today, all we're concerned about is I call this whole thing the dashboard. It's just what I named it for simplicity, but the dashboard contains this, and then this is the quote collection. Quote collections have quotes. Quotes have phrase collections, and those have phrases. So this is a phrase, this is a quote with a phrase, quote with a phrase. This is one quote with two phrases, okay? So that's what we're building. We've got a like button, and this would be a link to go create a quote. And here's our structure for code. It's really simplified, but I want to make sure that it's clear as far as what's going on, okay? And feel free to holler out with questions as we go along. I want to show you what testing would look like not with Enzyme. And so Facebook with React ships these things. Technically it's a separate NPM library, but they have something called the test utils helpers. And so, okay, we're going to jump into some code now. And this is a simple example. A few things I want you to notice before I talk about any of this. All the imports I've left out of the future slides. I assume they're going to be pretty basic, and I'll kind of mention it if needed. But you guys know about importing, right? Okay. This is something that I just learned about. You can, with Webpack, you can import JSON. It's cool. And if you don't configure Enzyme properly to do that, it won't work. That's cool. So, all right. So we're going to look into our components here. There's the dashboard. I've set us up with a context. Not super important here. Has anybody not done Mocha or Jasmine's EDD syntax? Okay, so just want to describe it real quick. So Mocha and Jasmine are types of their test frameworks. Okay, so I just don't want you to be lost while we're looking at this. Effectively, in my mind, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but these lines here, describe and context, are for humans. Basically, it's a way to group things, and it's not so much for the computer. It's mostly for you as a developer to go back. Now, some exceptions are, right, they define a scope. So you can declare variables within these blocks, and that scopes it to that set of tests, okay? But, you know, it's supposed to be readable for humans. Here, I'm going to describe this test. Here's a context. So here, my context here is with Facebook's test utils. Another context might be with Enzyme. And you can see, okay, you've got this context, context, and context. I'm waiting for somebody to be like, you're wrong. No, it's like this. Oops. Sorry. All right. So if you want to render something and then test it, you're going to use this test utils render into document method. How you guys doing in the back? Can you read that? Okay, good. So you can see I've got this dashboard, and I'm passing in the quotes as props, okay? So this is returning a React component. And then we can do things on this React component, such as start looking through it. So I don't know if you can read this, and if you haven't used it yet, but scry rendered components with type. scry. Why did they choose the word scry? But scry means to look into a crystal ball. And so it's kind of like the word find, which is another word that they could have chosen. I think it might have been somebody's clever use. They're thinking to themselves over at Facebook, like, I know this cool word scry, and I'm going to use it. And the only other thing, so it says scry, and it's plural. If you use find, it's singular. So there's a find method that's very similar. Basically, it's find rendered component with type. It's cool, and it might have the word DOM in there, but it's for singular uses. That's where you expect one thing. And I think if it finds multiple, it's going to instantly fail the test for you. Okay. And so we get that object back. We're finding them, and sorry that it ran off the page, but we're looking for a quote collection. And what's cool about this is you can see that I didn't have to put this in quotes. So I actually just get to use the variable, and because React stores the variables as you create elements, and when it attaches to the DOM, you just get to pass it in directly like that. And I thought that was really cool. It reminds me of Ruby and some of the power there. And then we run and expect. So the cool thing about these assertions, by the way, are shy. And what's great is when you write these assertions, they read like English. We expect the quote collection to have a length of 1, meaning there should be one quote collection. Okay? And sorry, something I need to point out. I've got these lines here. Use chai and enzyme, and up at the very top we're importing enzyme. It shouldn't be on this slide. We're not dealing with enzyme yet. Okay? All right, so here is a much longer thing. So we are iterating through this entire DOM structure, and there's a lot on that page, so I just hope that you're not even trying to digest that. We're crawling through the DOM. So if you remember a few slides back where I said, okay, we're going to have the dashboard, quote collection, all that, it's just walking through there. And I'm just showing you one way that you could. And so you've got a few numbers in here. I'm actually, saying that there should be 3 quotes. And then when we use the array access here, I'm saying I just decided I'm going to look into the 3rd quote, which has 2 phrases. And I just picked that one kind of arbitrarily, but I wanted to make sure that one has two phrases instead of 1, just to make sure that the test ran. And at the very end, we're checking that there's some text. Okay. And to me, this is pretty gross. And would you ever do this? Well, that's debatable. But there's a lot of stuff going on in here. And I mean, it's just a lot.
You comment this?
What's that?
You comment? You code comment these?
Would I
Would you
normally? I sure hope so. So this is a demo app, and I apologize. Honestly, it's not something that you should look at to be like, this is how to do it. It's like, there's just examples. So this has a GitHub repo that's private, and if I can figure out how to not be embarrassed enough about it, maybe I could release it. But so would you comment this? Yeah, I mean, who else is going to want to run? Personally, okay, at the very least, you've got this renders a full section of DOM. That's not very helpful. In the real world, you would say something more like finds, it renders a phrase with the following text. And at the very least, somebody knows, okay, at a high level, here's what's going on. Here's what I expect this code to be doing. I don't know if I would actually code it. It's one of those things where after you get familiar with it, it's not that hard. It's just verbose.
I've never used it.
Okay, good.
So it's readable.
As long as we get past that word scry, it's not terrible, right? Okay. So here's my picture of the crystal ball. I thought I would mention this. So why did Facebook not give us better tools? I don't actually know. I would love to have somebody who's talked to somebody over at Facebook. When they released Flux, they said, hey, here's this cool thing called Flux. It's really neat. It helps you. And here's like an example of how you could use it. But they didn't at first release it as like, this is the way to do it. And you can understand why people would not want to try to tether anyone to like, this is the only way. But if you don't give some guidance to how things should be used, it's hard to expect the community to really pick this up and run with it, right? So with these test utils, they even say in the documentation, more or less, do I have it written? I might have it written later. They basically say some other test framework could be on top of this and make it more useful. And spoiler alert, that's what Enzyme is. But why are those tests so long? It's because I think Facebook, they just thought, somebody else will build something on top of it. We're just going to give you the base layer, and it should be good enough, right? Okay, a few things. Even though the method is called render in the document, it doesn't actually render into the document. It's just creating an element. So that element can live on its own. It doesn't necessarily need to be in the document. I don't know how much that would actually matter to you, but I thought it was interesting, something that I came across in their source code, and they're thinking about renaming it to clarify that. So if you see that gone in the future, that's why. To be able to render, though, you do need to have a DOM, okay? So if you're unit testing, oftentimes unit tests, you don't want to run them with a DOM if you've done this before in Mocha or whatever, because they'll run a lot faster. To have a DOM slows things down. But for these, for full rendering, you do need it. So meaning you either need to run in a browser, like Chrome, any real browser. You can use Phantom, or you can use JS DOM. So let's do this. Who's used Phantom before? Or any variants, thing like Phantom? Okay. Who's used JS DOM? Okay. Because they're probably using JS DOM if you want to do isomorphic apps or universal apps or something. Is that what you're doing? Okay. All right. So on that last slide, it was this long. What's the problem with that? Like, it worked, right? It did the thing. It found the text that we were looking for. That test pass. It's not useless, but what's wrong with it? Did I already write? Because you are. Oh, okay. Yeah, go ahead.
The moment the index changes, your test breaks. So you'd have to keep updating the index.
Exactly. Okay, and so, did you guys catch that? You saw all those lines of code that go find this one thing. And if that's the thing that you're looking for, you have to do it, but what you're violating there is it's not actually a unit test. You're not testing the unit. So that code was written with the context of, the describe block, but it was dashboard. Really, the test should only be testing the dashboard. And if you start working your way down into the tree, you're into other components. You're violating the idea of a unit test. Now, you need to test eventually that all those things work together, but that's not what a unit test is, and that's not what we're working on right now. Okay? So, thanks. All right. I want to show you spies. So spies are your way of knowing what methods have been run. So let's see, did I pass it? All right, I've changed things up a little bit since the last slide. We're still rendering the dashboard and we're passing the quotes, but we're also passing this method called this prop on create link. And if you recall how that quote board was laid out, there's just a button there that says create link. Well, we want to know when somebody clicks it, does it actually work? And you can use a library called, it's pronounced differently, but some people pronounce it sign-on or sinon. And it's a way to spy on things and to understand what methods were actually run. Okay, so has anybody used it before? Okay. So what I'm not showing you right here is the code that actually in the dashboard component, I'm not showing that. I'm only showing you the test, but you can imagine it's really simple. It's just a text link that calls this method. So with their test utils tools, we've got simulate and click it. And also in that component, we specify a ref. And what's interesting, this is to me a way where using refs is typically frowned upon, or if you're using refs, are you doing it right? Sometimes you have to, but what's interesting to me about this is I don't need this for Enzyme, and we'll show you this later. but you need it for Facebook's test utils. And what's interesting about that is then that means that you're changing how you build your components for the sake of testing. And that's normal, that's going to happen, but ideally you wouldn't want to change what you're building just for the sake of testing. Okay. And here's some syntax at the end. Pretty readable, right? I mean, it's pretty cool. The thing about this that will bite you, and I don't even know why they built it this way. So this right here is chai syntax, right? This is not a fault of Facebook or anything else. This is the way that chai wrote these assertions. If you have a typo in here, your test will pass. So if I wrote called Tyler is awesome, that test will pass, but it doesn't actually work. So why they chose to do it that way instead of having an explicit requirement for calling with parentheses to actually call that method, I don't know why they've done that. I've messed it up a few times and just been scratching my head, and it doesn't always take forever, but I don't understand. So just be on the lookout for that. Okay, so here I just wanted to show a deep call. So imagine, go back out to our view of the screen that we built, the quote board, and you can like a quote, right? Like Facebook style like. So those links live on the quotes and not on the dashboard. So we have to dive in there to get to them. And again, I had to pass that through. So we're passing this like quote method to the dashboard, and the dashboard has to pass it to the quote collection, has to pass it to the quote, but that's fine. And eventually when you click on it, it's going to run this method. So here we are just checking to make sure that that works. Okay. So here is a way to find out if the text is in there, right? If you just want to measure or test that it spit out some text. And again, this is the type of thing where I was asking myself, like, it shows some text, it doesn't show some text, like that's easier. Why do we even need to test this? But I wanted to show you how to do it, and I think it's these simple tests that, I mean, what's your alternative to doing a unit test and to doing this? Your alternative is to go do it manually, and if you do it manually, you have to go set up the state. Maybe you need to log in. Does anybody here use hot refresh? What's it called? Hot module replacement. Okay, pretty cool, huh? Pretty cool. I've gotten that working with Redux. I haven't set that up yet for the React stuff because you have to use the web dev server, and I had trouble doing that with Webpack, and Sales.js is the backend I'm using. But what a cool idea! So it really speeds up how fast you can reload your site, but still, to like type some code, to go over there, click some stuff, I mean, it just takes time. Where you have your console open up in the other window, you press save, it runs it, you're done in a number of milliseconds. That's pretty cool. Okay, so here's the other thing that this is, they're still calling this experimental on their docs. It's been around for a long time, so I wouldn't call it experimental. This is what's cool. So if you think back a few slides where I said, why are we doing it this way? We're reaching down into the DOM, we're traversing, we shouldn't do that. Shallow rendering is your opportunity to just render at basically a flat level. So you're not doing that. You're not going down into the nodes. And so now we're starting to talk about unit tests. And so what you're going to get is you can see that we've got the div. It's comparing, it spits out the div and some of the HTML, and it's going to spit out what's inside it, but just at that first level. So we can see that quote list is here. Excuse me, and so this is a slide that this really should say quote collection. Quote collection renders all that stuff below it, but we're not showing it. Or excuse me, the shallow render is going to leave it right there. And that's great. That's your way to not have to test the potentially hundreds of, nodes underneath it. And we got to do deep equal because of identity versus equality, okay? Or value, I should say. Question? All right, so now we're going to move on to Enzyme. So just to recap real quick, with the Facebook tools, there's basically two big parts of it that I view. You've got your full rendering, they call it full DOM rendering, and you've got your shallow tests. And Enzyme kind of breaks it up in the same way. Enzyme's analogs would be mount and shallow. So first of all, what is Enzyme? I thought for once that somebody actually described their product pretty well. Basically, Enzyme is a wrapper to Facebook's utils. So underneath, they're still using the things that I just showed you. They're just making it way more convenient. And it's similar to jQuery, so this DOM UI that we're all used to now by doing selectors with divs, or you can give it a class name, IDs, things like that. Makes it far more convenient, okay? All right, so here's, just to show you the equivalent, here's how we can mount into the DOM. And I like this syntax, you know, we expect the dashboard to have exactly one descendant of type police. That's pretty cool. All right, now this is similarly long. I just wanted to show you the comparison. You know, if you wanted almost a one-for-one of walking the DOM. I didn't comment this, but it's similarly verbose where, you know, I'm creating these intermediate things to check all along the way. One thing, you know, if a test passed, you wouldn't need to check all along the way that it's set up properly. But if you try to check with only one test at the end, one expectation, one assertion, and it fails, it's really hard to know, well, what went wrong. So we check all along the way. Now, one thing that's cool about Enzyme is their style is more functional, so we can make this much shorter if we want to. So this is the exact same thing, much quicker, okay? And it's because, I didn't explain this very well, but when we mount, what this is giving back to us, Enzyme's mount method, is a wrapper. They call it the React wrapper. The shallow is going to give you back a shallow wrapper. But because you have this wrapper, you can keep calling methods on it. And they give you all sorts of really handy methods. But in each case, find, at, all of these things are going to give you wrappers so you can more quickly traverse the tree. Okay? So to me, and I could have written this out slightly more legibly, I think, you know, on new lines, I was concerned about people being able to see from the back, but I think this is pretty legible. The remaining, you still have the same problem where you can see that we're given indexes here, right? So this is going to blow up if it doesn't happen to have the same fixture, the same structure, the exact quotes, phrases in it. And I wanted to show a way to do a real simple contains. Contains can be super useful, yeah.
I've never used it before. I was wondering if it's possible to reach download an ID or something.
Absolutely. So, and that's something that Enzyme gives you. I don't actually have any examples like that, but let me, oops. Okay. In this example, you know, I'm using descendants and the actual component, but you're able to use, you could put quotes around this, or you could put div tags, or you could do div.className, div pound ID. So the short answer would have been yes. Okay. Okay. And here's Enzyme's shallow method. Again, the shallow method is going to give you back a wrapper that you can start to call methods on it. So one of their convenience methods that they give you is contains. And with contain, I would have expected, this is interesting because I thought I would have written the contain on the shallow and not on the expectation. So this is not how I would have thought, but I know that this test passes, so this actually works. And I gotta.
That's the header, right?
But does it break if you do it?
This is the header.
Yeah.
This is that text. Yeah, you could call it the header, but it's not part of a quote. So
First thing you do.
yeah, it was this thing right here, right? And it's really simple. Is that even necessary? But I wanted to put it in there so that the dashboard itself had something that wasn't merely a child. And that's why I put it in there. So does anybody use Enzyme already? No? Rats. I'm so bummed about Ivan was a guy who said he's an Enzyme expert, and I wish he could have been here to clarify. So I'll have to look into.
Shallow returns in very constant, which has the hill down. That down contains that.
Well, it's going to give you back a wrapper, and you can run contains on that wrapper. But what we're actually running here is chai assertions on the expect, and what expect is returning. So I will have to look into why that's working. It's nice and legible, though. Readable. Okay.
Assume that it's your chai plugin. So like set up rarely.
Yes. See, I'm glad you're here. Okay, do you remember at the very beginning when we started looking at that code, I said, here's some imports that aren't needed for right now because at the moment we were talking about the Facebook test utils. Well, you do need those lines for when we're working with Enzyme. And excuse me, you don't need both of them. So chai is what's considered an assertion library. And it's code that lets you write how you assert something worked or didn't work slightly differently. So kind of the built-in, you can use words like assert or even just check it yourself manually. Does this thing equal that? And if not, throw. But chai lets you write it a little more like prose, like English, so it's easier to read. And I think the chai enzyme library is probably what helped me with that contains block. So thanks for remembering that. Uh-oh. Sheet. Let me plug this thing in. When I bought this thing in 2013, the battery lasted like 8 hours.
But I think your expect is working because it has something truth inside of it just intuitively, and then you're running that other piece of code on the expect, and it just doesn't.
Truthy because it's contained?
Yeah, there was something inside of the expect, so I wonder if that was a truthy value that passed the expect. I don't.
Maybe, but it was contained, so that's actually that should be running some code and should be. I'll have to get back to you guys on that. Okay, so I don't know how useful this would be. You can use shallow to get deeper. And do I have an example of this? No. I don't know why you would. Again, if you did that, you would be kind of violating the idea of unit tests. And if you're going to use shallow and go deeper, why not just use mount in the first place? So I don't know why that was something that they gave you, but for convenience, they allowed it. I looked through the Enzyme source code, and it's pretty cool what they did. It's impressive how difficult it is to render some of the things that they do, or to traverse the nodes. They actually had to do a lot of work. I thought a lot more of that would have been given to them by Facebook, but it wasn't. So what they did is cool. And when I talk about how cool it is, they have some very useful methods that they offer. If you use debug, it's just going to give you a text dump of what the thing is. So if your test is failing in the middle, even before it gets to your expectation, you're like, what's going on? Why? I know I have a div in here. Why isn't that working? Then you could use debug to get your answer. Text is useful because a lot of times I just want to know if there's text on the page. I want you to ignore the HTML that's rendered. Okay? And then, conversely, I want to look at the HTML, so give me the full dump. And while I thought that setting up Enzyme was kind of a pain, which I'll talk about in a second, I thought their documentation, other than that, was decent. They do list out the entirety of the methods, both for rendering, deep rendering, mounting, and for shallow, so that's good. And one thing I didn't do, so last second I just copied and pasted these from their site. It's a little bit easier to simulate clicking with Enzyme. Again, I think it's a little bit more readable. So in this, they're simulating a click event, they're setting it up, they've got this foo thing, don't even worry about it. It's just a nothing. So on our wrapper, we're going to find something. So here's your example of a div, or excuse me, an element name. Go ahead and then you just call simulate on it. So it's functional. It's really easy to use. I think it reads really well. And then we expect what it called. And something that I didn't show you and didn't talk about yet, but I think it's really great. So when you use, where did it go? Okay. I don't think this is the case for using shallow, but if you use mount, you get the full life cycle. So in this case, they're testing component did mount, was that called? And that can be really useful. Why are my React lifecycle methods not being called or being called when I don't expect them to? Question?
Are they patching called once onto that prototype?
This is a chai assertion. Okay, so yeah, sorry if definitely need to look into this. I also think the documentation for sign-on is written pretty well. So in this case, we are spying on foo's component did mount. And what's cool about this is you're spying on it, but the method will still run as normal, but you're able to tell, because of sign-on, exactly what happened. You can find out what methods were passed to this, or what arguments were passed to this method. You can find out, was it called, how many times, all the things like that. You can do a lot more with sign-on. You can stub it, so you can tell it, look, if you get called, return this, and just to help you set up your tests and make it easy. But sign-on is a really cool library. I recommend it. Okay, so what were some of the challenges with all of this? First of all, I thought it was a pain to get it set up in Webpack. So Webpack was definitely something that most everybody in this room raised their hand for. I feel like I've gotten a really good handle on Webpack now, but at the time it was a pain. And so it's frustrating. I personally need to go help them fix their documentation because it's just silly that, I don't know. So I would love to be in Airbnb's. Airbnb is the group that wrote Enzyme. Why they did have some of the documentation be so lagging, I don't know. I know it's a real world, but I'd really love it to be cleaned up. So if you need help with getting it set up, having a person, somebody in this room on an AZ Web Devs Slack team or me can be a real help. Okay. Now, so we're almost out of time here, so I'm not going to go real deep into this, but I just thought it would be real helpful as far as one of my biggest questions that I'm always dealing with is like, when somebody tells me about a new technology or some tool that I can put into my tool belt to make my life better, I'm like, what is that thing? So someone will say, hey, you should use the Fahoozy Gods, and I'm like, what is that? And typically the quickest answer for me is if somebody would start off with, well, it's the same thing as that, but for JavaScript, or something. So what is Sales? Well, it's Ruby on Rails for JavaScript. What is Enzyme? Well, is there a good analog to Enzyme? Is anybody else using anything besides Enzyme? Okay. So, what's that?
I'm wondering what you're using.
Oh, yeah. We use Conda.
But you're not using Enzyme? Okay, so I'm using Karma. I didn't get to show you any of my code, but I'm using Karma. So Enzyme is a library it's a helper library, is how I would describe it. What is a helper library? So let me just give you the quick overview. In the testing world, you've got test runners, you've got test frameworks, and you've got assertion libraries. We could get into like types of testing, unit, integration, acceptance, all that type of stuff too, but let's just describe. So Karma is one type of a test runner. Basically, that means, I think the simplest, most concrete way of describing it is, what's the binary when you're sitting at your terminal and you're saying, run these tests, what are you going to run? So you could use something like Karma. And where that helps you is, it's the thing that's going to go, you've changed your source code or your test methods, let me go rerun it. Now sometimes these things jumble together. You can also use Mocha, but really Mocha has its own test runner built in. So what we were looking at, I was using Karma and Mocha and Chai. So Karma would be a test runner, right? It's the thing that's responsible for running your tests. Your test library is Jasmine. Mocha is the thing that gives you these methods like describe, context, and it. And anybody have a better definition than that? Okay. Trying to check out if I'm losing anybody here. And assertion libraries, I think I already mentioned this earlier, but those are your opportunity to change how do you say whether the test passes or not. So with Chai, you can use expect. It can be one way. You can also use should. And so what I've done here, to be really clear, if you're not in this world, I'm using a lot of libraries and tools where you could choose to use other stuff, and that's totally fine. And I don't have a great way, I don't have the time to show you what you could use instead. But so what's an alternative to Chai? I don't even know. You can use just a built-in assertion and invariant syntax. But if you want it to read well, I recommend using Chai. It's probably the de facto standard, so I don't know if there's a great reason to use anything else if you're starting for the first time. Okay, so getting all of Karma, a few weeks ago before starting this, I had Webpack set up, and I thought, oh, I really get it now, and I love it, and yay. And then I had to do Karma with Webpack, and it was another layer of oh, why is this? And then I had to do Enzyme, and Enzyme requires you, because, okay, for whatever reason, they decided to make Enzyme compatible with multiple versions of React at the same time. So React has 0.13, 0.14, and they started calling it 15 now instead of 0.15. And the Enzyme library works with all three, as opposed to one of the ways that they could have done it is, okay, Enzyme version 19, or excuse me, 2 point something works with React 13. And 2.1 works with React 14. And 2.2 works with React 15. They could have done it that way. Because of the way that they did it, where it works for all three at the same time, it makes it a little harder to set up. In Karma, you have to set a few things, Karma and Webpack, you have to set a few things as external, and I'm not even going to explain with that, but when you're crying yourself to sleep later, just come to me about that, okay? All right, has anybody used Jest? Oh, come on, nobody? Oh, good, that means I can make fun of it as much as I want, and nobody will know better. I didn't like Jest. That's all I have to say about it. I thought it was slow and a real pain. They have some good ideas in there. Jest is another testing framework. It's one of the good ideas with Jest is that they auto-mock stuff for you. What that means is when you're dealing with your code, typically your code should not try to, if it calls out to another piece of code, it shouldn't have that, that thing should be fake. All you're really trying to do is test, did it call that? Because you're testing that thing separately, right? You're already writing tests for that. So why do you need to test the communication? You just want to say, did my piece of code reach out to that? So they have this idea of auto-mocking. They do it for you. You don't have to say, okay, this method is fake. You don't have to, you remember the sign-on.spy stuff that we were doing? You don't have to do that as some of the theory behind it, but I found it to be a pain. There were so many times where things weren't working that you go onto the GitHub issues and invariably somebody's saying, well, did you turn off the auto-mocking for that? So I don't even know what to say about Jest and why they set it up that way that they did. All right, so do we need testing? No, yeah. There's no right answer. Like, what if you're writing a really small project and you've got a deadline, you got to get it done? Okay, don't use testing. If I had to write this example app, if I really like that was it, that was all I was doing, would I write tests? Well, I would. Even at that level, it starts to be like, yeah, but so I don't know. What's the simplest project? If you wanted to write a prototype for somebody, maybe you wouldn't use tests, right? If you're just trying to show your boss, look how quickly I can build apps in React, maybe you wouldn't do testing for that. But in my opinion, typically, yeah, you want to use unit testing, and it's going to buy you a lot. Remember, we talked about it, not just the tests themselves, but all the things that go along with it, how it frames, it shapes how you design, it gives you the confidence, so many things beyond just the tests themselves.
I have a quick question. With Webpack, when you're running your tests, are the tests constantly running? So each time you save, is it testing your component that you build, or is it only at the end when you compile your everything that you want to put up on your web server? Or?
Good question. So the question is, how often does it, or when does it run those tests? And the answer is, you can configure it however you want. I could not get, for the life of me, I could not get Mocha to watch my tests, but theoretically you can.
Okay.
It just wasn't working for me, but you can configure it. One thing that's nice is, okay, here's a consideration that we haven't talked about. One of the reasons you wouldn't test is the tests themselves can take a long time to run. So imagine if you had a huge suite of tests, right? You're GoDaddy, and you just have a lot of tests because you've got a big project. They take several seconds to run. So one nice thing that you can do is you can say, only run this test right here, so that it's fast. But the short answer is you can configure it. And
I just have my package JSON. I have a specific one to watch certain files for my testing.
yeah, okay.
And then before I commit it, I run everything.
Yes, good call. So if your tests are slow and you don't always run them, make sure you test before you commit, right? Before you do the, and depending on how you have things set up, some people have their project set up with a continuous integration server, and what that can do is run your tests automatically when you try to commit code. And if your tests don't pass and you broke it, you're in trouble. You get a slap on the wrist, and your code doesn't make it into production. That's pretty cool, but that's on a, you're on a serious level there if you're starting to do continuous integration. Jenkins, CI, Circle, all this stuff. Yeah. Shoot, what was I going to tell you? One of the most useful things that I did when I was having trouble, here's a pro tip, okay? I set up Karma such that if I change the Karma configuration, the whole thing would reboot. All right, so once you've started Karma, you can change your source files and your test files, and those will get rerun. But I was having so much trouble setting up Webpack. I was like, why isn't this working? I know this is something to do with Webpack. I would have to change my Karma configuration and go restart Karma manually. And when you're doing that like so many times, it would be great to have an auto. So I use a tool called NodeMon, which I think is short for Node Monitor, and can automatically restart things for you. And it can restart anything, but you choose. So in my test case, I had restart Karma, or if I change the Karma configuration. Okay. All right, that's it. Yeah.
So is Enzyme a library for running tests, or is it a runner? And why do you need to adjust, what do you need to change Webpack to make it use Enzyme? If it's just a library.
Great question. So it is a library. It's not a runner, and you would use it. So let me try to paint you a picture here. I use Karma. You can use other things, but Karma, one of the great things about Karma is it runs things in browsers and optionally multiple browsers at the same time. So you can have your test be run in Chrome, Firefox, Phantom.js, Safari, all that type of stuff. And whether you would really want to do that kind of depends on how many people use those browsers, Explorer, Edge, that type of thing. How big your project is, do you really, really care? Typically, this is how I get away with it, but typically I'm like, nobody uses Internet Explorer, right? So I don't even test over there. And then when I have people use Internet Explorer, then I got to go figure out what's going on for them. And in an ideal world, I would run it in all of those browsers all at the same time. Okay, so Karma is the test runner. And then the library that it's using, the test framework, is Mocha. And Mocha is what gives us the describe and the context and the it blocks of code that help us to scope what we're working on and those types of things. And then when you're working with React, you want to use Enzyme. So Enzyme is a test library that's used by Mocha, or I wouldn't even say it's used by Mocha, but you use it alongside your test framework. So I can see by your face I didn't quite explain it.
Can you show us your webpack config?
Why do we?
Oh yeah, sorry. Okay, sorry, I lost your question. I'm sorry about that. Yeah, let me show you what I got.
So usually for transpiling, we do that step.
Uh-huh.
For specific library, it's just a package.
It feels like rendering one React component should use webpack.
Maybe I'm missing something.
Okay.
Actually, I guess that's dependencies.
So there's a lot here. Let's not digest it all at the same time, okay? Or all at once. But what's the most relevant parts? Okay, let me just make sure I understand. I can talk about it and help anybody with specifics, but your question is, why do we need Webpack just to use Enzyme? And the answer is you don't. Is that your question? Help me.
No, I actually wanted to see
Okay, great.
your webpack configuration.
Yeah.
See how you configure.
So this configuration, this is Karma, and you can see this Webpack section inside, and it doesn't perfectly model a normal Webpack. For example, you're not going to see an output section, which you normally would have for your production library, but because you don't need that for testing the way that it injects it into the browser. But so let's see some important stuff. This is a lot, and this is the minimum that I needed to get this working. You might have less if you don't want to use Karma. You wouldn't have the Karma stuff at all. But there's nothing for what I did for this tiny little project. Nothing here is extraneous. All of this is needed, and the reason I mention that is there's just a lot to it. And after you've dealt with it for a while, it starts to make sense. And okay, but there's a lot going on. So you see all these specific mentions of sign-on. Like you just have to make sure that Webpack doesn't bark on those. So your questions about Enzyme, here's the external section that I was mentioning. And the reason you have to do this is basically, so the way that Webpack works is it goes through all your code and it looks for require statements, right? And whenever it finds a require, it replaces it so that it can build one giant thing. Well, if your code has conditionals for which library it will require, then it's going to give Webpack trouble. So Enzyme, if they have conditionals where they're checking, are you using React 13, React 14? Or really, it's React 13 or 14 or 15. And so because that's a conditional, Webpack has trouble on that. And so what you have to do is set those require statements as externals, and then you're, and I've got it documented here, so this was a real pain, but I'm just trying to make sure if I answered your question of like, yeah? Okay. Oh, good. Great.
Also, if you're going to share
I will. Tell you what, if anybody requests it, it was a mess. I really scrambled to put it together, so this is not a project that I'm proud of. But for some of the most important parts of like, hey, it runs Karma. It can help you, give you some examples of what to do. It's probably still useful. So why don't you give me a little bit to clean it up, make it slightly more useful. I probably won't just complete the entire project, but you can have this. And I mean, whoever this guy on issue 47, the other dude was just 5 days ago or something, he's like, here's what I had to do to get it for working for React 15. I've only used React 14 until this practice project, and I did 15. And like, if this guy hadn't have said this, I might still be working on this right now. And I'd be like, sorry, it's canceled. Or I'm so glad that somebody was willing to write, here's how to get it to work. Okay. So yeah, there's a lot to it, and I'm not going to try to go through it. I think tooling is the hardest part about testing. The other part is testing takes a different approach, but before you even get to the approach of like how do I write tests, you have to have your tool set up, and this can be really daunting. It can be really frustrating if you can't get your testing set up and running and auto watching and all those types of things. So this is definitely an example where you want to tug on somebody's sleeve and be like, hey, can you just help me out with this? And so the AZ Web Devs Slack team can be an example, and then we can screen share or something like that. But so I highly recommend having a buddy system for this. Okay. All right, so that's what I got on testing for React with Enzyme. Thank you guys. So the